These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. White to move. What is the best move? You see that white has two heavy pieces aimed at d8 but that the square is defended twice as well. Since one of the defenders is the king, think about forcing it back under its pawn cover where it can't defend d8. The natural way to do this would be with a diagonal attack like one. Bishop moves to h3, check. But here that move fails because black can interpose pawns on the g and f files, and the f pawn would have protection. Yet you still should notice that white has two pieces, that same bishop and also a knight trained on a square adjacent to black's king, b7. So the check one. Bishop takes at b7, check. Has to be considered, as any check would be, and you see that it forces black to play king moves to b8. That move changes things, of course, as d8 now is guarded just once. White mates with the usual 2 against 1 sacrifice, 2 queen moves to d8, check. Rook takes queen, rook takes rook, checkmate. The lesson is to see that there is more than one way to drive a king back from a mating square it is trying to protect. A check of any sort may do it. White to move. What is the best move? Here is another illustration of a by now familiar point. Black's king looks secure if you focus only on white's queen and rook, if white plays 1. Queen takes queen, check. Black replies king takes queen and then his king defends e8. But if you are attentive to all of your resources you see the knight powerfully placed on g4 and able to give check on h6 or f6. The f6 square is guarded by black's knight, but h6 is more vulnerable. One knight moves to h6, check. Would require black to either move his king to h8 or to play pawn from g7 takes knight. Consider both. A. If black plays king moves to h8, his king has been driven back from f8 and the queen that sits on that square, so now white mates with queen takes queen. B. If black instead plays pawn from g7 takes knight, this opens his pawn cover and invites consideration of a check on the newly available file, rook moves to g3, check. This forces king moves to h8, as black's queen is pinned. Now again white mates with queen takes queen. It's another study in the variety of ways a king can be driven into a corner so that it can't participate in its own defense. White to move. What is the best move? The question this time is whether white can mate. He has the telltale combination of a rook and queen aimed at f7, suggesting a mating sequence that would start with queen takes at f7, check. If black plays his king to h8, white mates immediately with queen takes at g7, a queen and rook on the 7th rank are fearsome. So black is unlikely to do that, and will instead play rook takes queen. Carefully assess what comes next. White has two rooks on the d-file, so rook moves to d8, check. Suggests itself. Black can reply either with the capture rook takes rook or with the interposition rook moves to f8, if black plays rook takes rook, white follows up immediately with rook takes rook, check. Getting mileage out of his doubled rooks. Now black would be forced to interpose with rook moves to f8. This might look secure, but when you see that the f8 rook would be defended just by its king, you should think about ways to drive the king back, as with bishop moves to c4, check. This forces king moves to h8, and now rook takes rook is checkmate. b. If black instead replies to rook moves to d8, check. By interposing with rook moves to f8 right away, however, the analysis is crucially different. Black still has two rooks on the back rank and white has no effective way to use his two rooks against them. He still can use his bishop to push black's king to h8, but then rook takes rook f8 is met by black with rook takes rook f8. So the mate fails, and the initial move queen takes at f7, check, should not be played. The important moral is to be careful in thinking through each of your opponent's possible replies. If any of them work, you mustn't go forward in hopes that he will make a mistake. Assume he will play his best move. Keeping all the possible replies straight can be tricky, of course, but when your moves are checks it is less difficult. Just be thorough then in asking whether he has a capture, or an interposition, or must move his king, for those are his only three options in reply. White to move. What is the best move? Combining back rank themes with forks. In our earlier studies of various tactical themes, we often saw them combined with back rank mates, queen forks, or discovered attacks, for example, in which a loose piece and a mating square on the back rank were the two targets threatened at once. But it still will help round out our consideration of back rank mates to reconsider those ways that the concepts studied here can be put together with the concepts we have examined elsewhere. Some general points. Think of back rank patterns not just as ways to mate but as ways to threaten mate that can be combined with other threats to create double attacks. The clues to look for are a king stuck behind its pawns or otherwise trapped, an absence or shortage of defenders on the back rank, and a piece you can aim there perhaps as part of a battery with a piece already so aimed. When these indications are present, there are a few ways they can contribute to forks even if the mating idea itself fails. A piece tied down to guard duty on the back rank may be unable to guard other squares within its reach, squares from which you can launch forks. B. If there is an enemy piece preventing the back rank mate from succeeding, it might itself make a good target for one end of a fork, just as a loose or pinned piece would. C. If the mating idea fails because your pieces get taken when they reach the back rank, it sometimes may be possible to inflict a fork at the end of the sequence against pieces that have been left loose there. D. Sometimes you will have no threat against the back rank, but you can make one, perhaps by moving your queen to an open file that leads there. Of course this gives your opponent a move he can spend defusing the threat. But the time he spends doing this gives you a move to use capturing something else. In other words, a back rank mate can be just another mating threat at one end of a fork, usually a queen fork. In the example to the left, white has an aggressively placed knight, and a look at its moves turns up a fork of black's king and queen with one. Knight moves to f7. The fork seems to fail because f7 is protected by black's rook, but then you play through black's capture rook takes knight and see that it removes the rook from the back rank, leaving black's king bereft of defenders there. So analyze the follow-up and be careful. The move of white's knight will have opened the e-file for the natural rook moves to e8, check. It would be easy to imagine that black now plays rook moves to f8, a useless interposition that gives white rook takes rook, checkmate. Or that black plays bishop moves to f8 with the same result. Not quite, however, for f8 will be guarded both by black's bishop and by the rook then on f7. All this need not dissuade you, it only should cause you to build backwards and start by taking out black's bishop with one. Queen takes bishop, pawn from c7 takes queen. Now comes the knight fork, knight moves to f7, check. Where black must forfeit his queen or play rook takes knight and be mated a move later. Assuming he lets go of the queen, white nets a piece with the sequence, the bishop he took at the outset, and of course this is better than just winning the exchange with one. Knight moves to f7, check. Rook takes knight, 2. Bishop takes rook. At bottom this is an example of motif, A, described above. The rook on f8 turns out to be overworked, its responsibilities on the back rank prevent it from guarding f7, which serves as a forking square for white. Black to move. What is the best move? Look at how black's rook attacks f1 and would mate there except for the protection provided to the square by white's queen. When a queen single-handedly guards against mate, it can become a vulnerable target in its own right. Targets in turn call for investigation of forks and other tactical strikes to try to win them. In this case black can pressure both the queen and the rook on g5 with queen moves to d2. From there he threatens queen takes queen, checkmate. And if white plays queen takes queen, his defender of the first rank is gone and black mates with rook moves to f1. White can avoid the mate by playing queen moves to g1, but then he loses the rook to queen takes rook. The position amounts to a simple queen fork of a loose piece and a key defender of the back rank, but to see it you have to be aware of both ideas. This is an example of the second pattern, B, mentioned in the previous frame. White's queen is committed to the first rank to prevent mate there, the piece therefore is immobile and becomes a good target for a fork. Black just needs to find a loose piece to go with it, which leads him to the rook on g5. White to move. What is the best move? White has a battery on the d-file and black's back rank is pretty weak. He has no defenders there, though his queen protects several of its squares. White thus contemplates 1. Queen moves to d8, check. And if black replies queen takes queen, then rook takes queen, checkmate. But one must consider all of an opponent's possible responses, and here black has a better one with the interposition 1. Black queen moves to f8. Does this spoil white's plan? No, because he remains mindful not just of mate but of other tactical goals, such as the creation of forks. Thus white can go ahead with 2. Queen takes queen, check. King takes queen and then play 3. Rook moves to d8, check. A fork of black's king and loose bishop that leaves white with a piece to show for the sequence. Consider this an example of motif, c, described at the start of this section. The back rank mate fails, but it forces black to arrange his pieces for a rook fork on the back rank that wins material for white. White to move. What is the best move? Now the same position just considered but a couple of moves earlier so you can see how it developed. There are 2 clues here, neither of them obvious but both visible with careful tracking. The first is the exchange of minor pieces white can initiate with 1. Knight takes bishop, rook takes knight. Anytime you can perform an exchange like this you want to consider its consequences. In this case it would leave a loose rook where the black bishop now stands. A loose piece is an important target, so naturally you look for ways to attack it and create trouble elsewhere at the same time as with 2. Queen moves to d2, which both goes after the rook and creates a battery on the d-file and so threatens 3. Queen moves to d8, check. Queen takes queen, 4. Rook takes queen, checkmate. It's a classic case of the last pattern, d, in the scheme set out a few frames ago. White combines a threat against a loose piece with a threat against black's back rank. After seeing this much it might be tempting to conclude that the idea works, but that's still premature, for ask whether black has any way to address both threats in the fork. This is especially important when his queen is available for defense, as it has the versatility to defuse widely separated threats at the same time. In this case black can play his queen to e7, where it guards the rook on b4 and also defends against the back rank threat by preparing to interpose at f8. And now we arrive at the position in the previous frame. White turns from motif, d, to motif, c, finishing with the rook fork. The threat of a back rank mate drives everything in the sequence, though the mate never actually occurs. Taken together, these last two positions are a good example of the style of thought you want to cultivate, looking constantly for double threats and for exchanges that loosen pieces to make the double threats work, and then looking beyond the first double threat to the next one, including other loose pieces, mating ideas, and so forth. These longer positions are worth going over until the logic of them flows quickly. White to move. What is the best move? Combining back rank themes with discoveries. We turn to intersections between the back rank mating theme and the discovered attack. In this first case your eye should be drawn to the battery of queen and rook on the open C file, then you see a bishop on C7 and realize you have the kernel of a discovery. If your bishop moves you have two heavy pieces aimed at C8 and the square is guarded just once, by the black bishop on B7. Since this is a mate threat your bishop will have a free move, and you therefore look for a black piece on a dark square that the bishop can attack. The knight on H4 is loose and thus makes a perfect target. White plays 1. Bishop moves to G3, if black doesn't move the knight, white takes it next move. If black does move his knight, white mates with 2. Queen moves to C8, check. Bishop takes queen, 3. Rook moves to C8, checkmate. Black to move. What is the best move? Spotting the idea for black here should be easy. You just have to recognize that the knight on D6 is not so much in the way of the D8 rook as masking it and creating the kernel of a discovery. White's back rank is weak, as D1 has no defenders, the queen on F2 looks ready to help, but then you see that it's pinned. So if the D6 knight moves, black threatens rook takes rook, checkmate. This means that black has something close to a discovered check and that his knight has a more or less free move. He plays knight moves to E4 and then takes the queen after white fends off the mate threat. Notice that this fending off has to be done carefully. Queen takes queen is not one of white's options, rook takes rook then mates for black, since his knight now seals off F2 as a flight square for white's king. B. If white moves his H2 pawn to H3 to create a flight square, black has queen takes queen, check. Followed by queen moves to G3, check. And then rook takes rook, checkmate. With the queen sealing the white king onto the back rank. C. If white plays rook takes rook, black has queen takes queen, check. Then queen moves to E1, checkmate. After white's king moves to H1. D. What white can do in reply to knight moves to e4 is move his queen to d4. Black does not then capture it, since it is pinned he attacks it with a pawn from e6 moves to e5. Then white can play pawn from f3 takes knight, and black answers pawn from e5 takes queen, winning a queen for a knight. Black to move. What is the best move? You can start by spotting the battery for black, this time on the c file, and once more you see a knight on the same file, an opportunity, not an impediment. True, white has a queen on c2 that would block the path of your heavy pieces to the back rank. But you play with the discovery anyway and see that the knight can give check with knight moves to d3. This invites black to play queen takes knight, but then the queen no longer blocks the file, and black mates on c1 because he has two heavy pieces aimed at the square against one black defender of it, the rook on a1. If white instead moves his king to d1, he gets mated even more quickly with queen takes queen, check. Yet white must address the check somehow, and since it is given with a knight there is no way to interpose. All that's left is pawn from e2 takes knight, forfeiting the queen to queen takes queen. This position can be understood as calling for a straightforward discovered attack against a loose queen, but of course you have to see the back rank mating possibility to grasp why white can't put out the fire easily with queen takes knight. White to move. What is the best move? There are several tactical clues on the board for white: the battery of rooks on the e-file, the kernel of a discovery created by the queen on c4 and the knight in front of it on d5, and the knight fork white can execute with knight moves to c7. The key is to see how these ideas relate to one another. Imagine the forking move knight moves to c7 and you notice that it also unleashes the discovered threat queen takes at f7, checkmate. Black can avoid this by playing queen takes queen, and that would quash white's idea if all he then had was knight takes rook, carrying out the fork. But still linking the various patterns on the board together, notice that knight moves to c7 also forks the e8 square against which white exerts pressure with his rooks. Thus if black replies to 1 knight moves to c7 with queen takes queen, white then has 2 rook moves to e8, check. Rook takes rook, 3. Rook takes rook, checkmate. As the knight guards the rook. This position combines three themes: the back rank mate, the knight fork, and the discovered attack. The crucial point to see is that white has two rooks lined up against a mating square, e8, and that black guards the square twice. By adding another attacker against the square, his knight, white creates a mating threat on e8 while unmasking still another mate threat in queen takes at f7, checkmate. The latter possibility is what prevents black from saving the day with knight takes knight. A theme to take away from these positions: a weak back rank can make a fine target for either of the pieces in a discovered attack. The attackers can land on the back rank directly. They also can create useful, distracting threats by adding pressure against a contested square on the back rank, thus threatening mate. Black to move. What is the best move? Combining back rank themes with pins. And now some intersections between our back rank patterns and the pin. Here black can play rook takes queen, but white's reply knight takes rook, check, is a nasty fork that wins the exchange when the smoke clears. So back off and assess the board. Your thinking about a position always should include attention to the enemy king's position and any vulnerabilities in it. Here that means seeing that white's king is trapped on h1 and ready to be mated if you can drop a heavy piece onto the back rank. You can't do that yet because your queen and rook are on the d-file, which white blocks with a protected pawn on d3. But don't stop there. Notice that this means the d3 pawn is pinned, since if it moves off of the d-file black has queen moves to d1, check. And then white only can offer the useless interposition queen moves to f1, resulting in queen takes queen, checkmate. For black, the natural way to exploit a pinned pawn is by taking something it protects, so black plays queen takes knight. Or does he? Before plunging forward with a move like queen takes knight, one must take due care to ensure that the position it leaves behind is safe. The good news after queen takes knight is that black threatens mate with queen moves to e1, so white has no time to take the rook that has been left loose on e6, rather, he has to evacuate his queen, as it is now hanging. But notice that since white is not himself in check, he has the liberty to give checks of his own, and with a loose rook lying around you have to make sure white's checks won't amount to anything. Let's see: 1. Queen takes knight, 2. Queen moves to h8, check. King moves to d7, 3. Queen moves to g7, check. King moves to c8, 4. Queen moves to f8, check. King moves to b7, 5. Queen moves to e7, check. King moves to b6, and now black's king is safe. White has at last made it possible for himself to play queen takes rook, but it's no help because it's not a check and thus gives black time to mate on the spot with queen moves to e1. So queen takes knight works here for black. Realize, though, that all this is a little delicate. If black plays 4. King moves to c7 instead of king moves to b7, he blunders away the game. Now white's 5. Queen takes rook, check, is a check that leaves black no time for queen moves to e1. Black does have the consolation of recapturing with king takes queen, but since his rook is off the board, white now is free to play pawn from d3 takes queen. All the pieces are gone. White to move. What is the best move? An inspection of your checks and their aftermath turns up 1. Rook takes knight, check. King takes rook. The important point to see about the king's new position is that it is trapped on the back rank by the white pawn on b6. And black's back rank is bereft of defenders. This means white probably mates if he can get a heavy piece onto the back rank, which in turn means that black's f6 pawn is pinned, since if it moves off the f-file white has rook moves to f8, check. And then mates after black tries useless interpositions with his queen and rook. The natural way to take advantage of a pinned pawn is by capturing something it protects, which white does with queen takes rook, check. And now black cannot avoid some version of the mate just described. The net of this is that white wins a piece, since if black sees all this coming he will reply to the initial rook takes knight, check, by moving his king rather than recapturing with it. The key idea in this position is that if black's king moves to b8, his pawn on f6 suddenly is pinned to his back rank. This is hard to see at first because it seems strange to think of a pawn being pinned to an empty square. These positions thus present an important general idea to contemplate. If you can manage to get the enemy king trapped on the back rank, notice that this may turn your heavy pieces into monsters and pin whatever enemy pawns or pieces block their path. Black to move. What is the best move? Black's situation looks rather desperate. His queen is about to be taken, and if it moves white is posed to mate with rook takes at g7 and a couple of simple follow-up moves. Black has no checks to give, but it always is worth looking at any mating threats that might be available. You should be especially conscious here of the weakness of white's back rank. His king is trapped in the usual way and has no defenders at all. Black thus wonders whether he can get one of his two heavy pieces there or at least threaten to do so in a way that will win something else. For now the implication is that the d4 pawn is pinned. The other point to notice is the relative pin that black imposes on white's rook. If the rook moves, white loses his queen. The way to exploit these ideas is by putting a piece and prize to the pinned rook and also to the d4 pawn and in a position to mate on the back rank. All this black does with rook moves to c5, threatening rook moves to c1, checkmate. Think about white's reply options. A. He can't interpose anything, so focus on captures or ways he might make his king safer. B. He can't capture the rook with pawn from d4 takes rook, this permits queen moves to d1, checkmate. Since as we know the d-pawn also is pinned to the back rank. C. He can capture the rook with rook takes rook. This forfeits the queen to queen takes queen, but still is his best bet. D. White's last option in reply to rook moves to c5 is to move his g-pawn to g3 to give his king a flight square. This loses a whole rook, as black then plays rook takes rook. If white replies queen takes rook, black has queen takes queen and his queen is the only piece left on the board, setting aside the kings, of course. White to move. What is the best move? combining back rank themes with removal of the guard. Finally, some positions illustrating interactions between back rank patterns and the removal of the guard. In this first example you see your two rooks on open files and imagine each of them penetrating to black's back rank. Rook moves to d8 would mate with support from the bishop on a5, except that black guards the mating square with his own bishop on f6. Rook moves to h8 also would mate again, except for the f6 bishop. That train of thought naturally leads to the conclusion that black's bishop is overworked, and that playing both rook moves might succeed where neither would alone. Starting with rook moves to d8, check. Fails because then black's bishop ends up on d8 and blocks the check from your rook on the h file. But 1. Rook moves to h8, check. Forces bishop takes rook, and then leaves behind a loose square where rook moves to d8, checkmate. Can be played. White to move. What is the best move? Your eye should start at black's back rank since you are close to mating with rook takes rook, only the queen far away on a3 prevents this. So turn to the queen and you ask how you can take advantage of its limited mobility, whether you can attack it, and whether it protects anything else you might attack. You see the rook on b2 that the queen ostensibly protects, and so think about ways of going after it. One queen moves to c1 isn't the answer because black has too many good replies. He can defend the rook with his c-pawn, or better still can simply play rook takes rook on his back rank. But notice that 1. Queen moves to c3 is an entirely different matter. Now white's queen attacks black's queen as well as his rook. If black plays rook takes rook on his back rank, white has queen takes queen. Yet if black instead plays queen takes queen, he is mated right away with rook takes rook. Black does have the option of queen moves to c5, where the queen moves to safety and still protects f8, but now white wins a rook with 2. Rook takes rook, check. Queen takes rook, 3. Queen takes rook. Presumably you see why starting with 2. Queen takes rook is no good. The back rank mate never does come to fruition, but the pressure created on black by the threat of it causes material losses elsewhere. We see again how even a mate threat that doesn't quite work can pay dividends. White to move. What is the best move? The pawn on h6 seals off g7 and thus traps black's king on the back rank. But a casual look at this position suggests that black has himself covered. If white plays rook takes rook, black has queen takes rook. If white plays queen takes queen, black has rook takes queen, and either way the remaining black piece prevents mate. The clue to white's solution is that black's queen and rook depend on each other. That means both pieces have a limited range of motion, and that white can experiment with putting pieces on squares that either of them are supposed to protect. So he looks for other mating ideas and thinks again of the pawn on h6. If white could put his queen on g7 he would mate there, so he starts in that direction with 1. Queen moves to f6. Black can only avoid queen moves to g7, checkmate. By playing queen takes queen, but then white mates anyway with rook takes rook. Black to move. What is the best move? Black attacks the f1 square twice, but the square is protected twice as well by white's queen and rook. The solution? A simple threat against one of the guards with pawn from b7 moves to b5. If the queen captures the b pawn, it gets taken by the c pawn. If the queen moves anywhere else along the diagonal leading to f1, it likewise gets taken. If the queen moves off of that diagonal, black mates on f1. Nor can white's rook be of assistance, since black mates if the rook moves off the back rank or moves to f1. White's best reply to the pawn thrust probably is queen takes at b5 followed next move by pawn from h2 moves to h3, forfeiting the queen but at least creating a flight square for his king and staving off mate for now. Or white can start with queen takes at b5, etc. The point, pieces that prevent mate, including a back rank mate, are vulnerable. Try forking them, try attacking what they protect, try making threats from squares they guard, try threatening them directly. Black to move. What is the best move? With white's king stuck and the d-file open, black naturally would like to mate with rook takes rook. The move is prevented by white's queen on g4, so make that queen your focus, look for anything else it protects or any way you can harass it, recognizing that its range of motion is limited by its defensive duties. You also want to be aware of any loose pieces on the board, such as white's rook on c2 here. Such pieces make good targets for double attacks, and a largely immobilized queen makes for another. Black therefore plays 1. Queen moves to e4, forking queen and rook. If white plays queen takes queen, black mates with rook takes rook, white just has a useless interposition. Are we done? Not quite, because you have to ask whether white has an answer, a place he can move his queen where it has protection and can protect both the mating square d1 and the forked rook on c2. As it happens, such a square exists in e2. But if white plays queen moves to e2 black has 2. Black queen takes queen, and after white's recapture rook takes queen black plays 3. Rook takes rook, check. And mate's next move, again white has a useless interposition. So white's best reply to queen moves to e4 is to move his queen to f3 where it continues to guard against mate, and thus to forfeit the rook on c2 to queen takes rook. If black instead forces an exchange of queens, white recaptures with his g-pawn and now his king has a flight square. Black to move. What is the best move? Other classic mating ideas. Introduction. You know it's good practice to castle, it brings your rook out from the corner and it puts your king safely behind a wall of pawns. Unfortunately your opponent knows this too, and if he does castle, how are you supposed to get at his king? Every game is different, but there are two general answers to that question. One, which we just examined, is to attack along the back rank, using the pawns in front of the enemy king to your advantage as they prevent it from escaping your rook or queen. The other general answer is to attack from the top and from an angle at the same time. There is a large family of mating patterns that involve this latter principle, establishing two lines of pressure, one diagonal and one vertical, from which the castled king cannot escape. One of the lines of pressure typically is exerted by a bishop aimed into the king's corner, the second, vertical line of pressure is exerted by a rook or queen along the h-file or g-file. The rook or queen may end up on a square next to the enemy king or may do their work from a distance. As we shall see, sometimes a knight or a second bishop or even a pawn can do the work that normally would be done by one of those other pieces just mentioned, but the easiest way to get started is just to think in terms of combining diagonal, bishop, and vertical, queen/rook, pressure in various ways. The usual challenge in these mates is to establish those two lines of pressure by tearing open the enemy king's pawn cover with a sacrifice. The castled king usually starts with a nice row of 3 pawns in front of it. If one of those pawns steps forward even one square, it creates a vulnerability, an open diagonal leading into the king's position. This is especially true of the g-pawn and f-pawn, as in their starting positions they block the diagonals leading to h8 and g8 respectively. So when a pawn in front of the castled king moves, consider it an invitation to place a bishop so that it runs through the square the pawn used to occupy. Then to create the complementary vertical pressure you need to open a file leading to the enemy king. This means the enemy pawn occupying the file must be removed so that your rook or queen will have a straight shot toward the same square or sector that your bishop attacks. There are various ways to do this. The important point for now is the overall goal, disrupting the pawn cover in front of the king to allow coordinated attacks against its position. Many of these mating patterns are beautiful and have storied pedigrees, being named after inventors or popularizers who lived long ago. The explanation of each will start with a skeletal example showing how it looks with the non-essential pieces cleared off the board. The key ideas and squares are identified, usually from white's side, thus we might speak of the importance of the f7 square, with the understanding that if you are playing the black pieces you use the square comparable to f7 from your side, i.e., f2. Sometimes we will avoid this confusion by referring to the king's bishop, the bishop that starts the game to the right of your king. If you are playing white, this is your light squared bishop, if you are playing black, it is your dark squared bishop. One more bit of jargon, we often will speak of heavy pieces, which, in case you have forgotten, means either a rook or queen. It is convenient to have a way to refer to those pieces without distinguishing between them, there are many mating functions that can be filled equally by either a queen or rook, and which you use will depend on which is available to you. Anderson's mate and kindred spirits, mating on h8. The first idea we explore involves putting a heavy piece, a queen or rook, on h8, where it mates with diagonal protection from the bishop or perhaps from a pawn on g7. The diagram to the left shows in skeletal form the position you are trying to reach. The rook on h8 could as easily be a queen, but when it is a rook the division of labor between the attacking pieces is particularly elegant. The rook covers the light squares the bishop can't reach, the bishop covers the dark squares and protects the rook. Black is mated. There are three general elements needed to create this pattern. A. An enemy king more or less stuck in the corner because f7 and perhaps f8 are blocked off as flight squares, usually by the king's own pawn and rook as in the diagram. This is a common state of affairs soon after a player has castled. B. An open line to h8 for your bishop because black's g-pawn has moved forward. C. An open h-file so that one of your heavy pieces can be dropped to h8. In practice you often need to make sacrifices to create these open lines. As a result this pattern and those that follow frequently require that you start with two of your pieces available to attack on the h-file, maybe two of them lined up on the file from the start of the attack, or one piece on the h-file and another that can get there in one move. The first piece is sacrificed to clear the way for the second, which is ready to go or arrives shortly, preferably with check. Anderson's mate generally refers to one particular type of sacrifice used to open up the h-file for this purpose. It is named after a famous game of Anderson's we will see in a moment. But you also might as well associate Anderson with this general point to make it easier to remember. If you have a diagonal attack against h8, you should ask whether you might mate there with a heavy piece even if it takes large sacrifices to get it done. White to move. What is the best move? Okay, so the particular idea of Anderson's mate is to achieve the result just described by A. First sacrificing the other bishop, the king's bishop, to open the h-file, B. Moving your queen onto the h-file, where it gives check, C. And then dropping your queen down to h8, where it mates. Here is an example. White sees that his queen is one move from the h-file and that he can obliterate the pawn on h7 with his bishop, so he plays 1. Bishop takes at h7, check. King takes bishop, 2. Queen moves to h5, check. King moves to g8, 3. Queen moves to h8, checkmate. Black's moves were entirely forced. Notice that with queen moves to h5 white seals off g6 as a flight square. Examine this diagram until you are clear on the role each white piece is playing. The f6 bishop holds the long diagonal and supports the mate on h8, the queen is ready to land on h8 in 2 steps, the bishop on e4 goes on a kamikaze mission to take out the pawn blocking the h-file. The two bishops both trained on the enemy king's position are a clue that this pattern may be available.